Welcome to Indus Special and the second part of our program on the paradoxes and dichotomies that inform our world. Yesterday in the first part, we discussed how far we have come from what was the fundamental premise of our existing intellectual frameworks, what Pankaj Mishra described as the assumption that humans are essentially rational and motivated by the pursuit of their own interests, that they principally act to maximize personal happiness rather than on the basis of fear, envy, or resentment. We determined that irrationality has returned. History has not ended with the victory of liberal capitalism and democracy over repressive state controls symbolized by the Soviet Union. Modern technologies, for all the good they do and the interconnectedness they provide, have also been pressed in the service of evil, as we witnessed in New Zealand, where the white supremacist attacker made and relayed the video of killings across the World Wide Web. Michel Foucault, in his Discipline and Punish, talked about the movement from the culture of spectacle to the carceral culture and determined that barracks, schools, and prisons are the places where modern society and state disciplines the people. To that, we can add digital technologies now, the ability of the state and groups to influence behavior through communication and to track people. It's the brave new world Huxley talked about, the rebirth of the dialogue between John the Savage and Mustafa Mond. In this part, we will discuss the historical and literary approaches to the idea of violence, non-state as well as statist violence, the use of language and how language becomes a highly strategic and political affair for the exercise of power, and how it is employed to create what David Kennedy called lawfare. We have with us Professor Sirajuddin, a former Dean of Arts and Humanities at Punjab University. We also have with us Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who's an Associate Professor of History at Quaid-e-Azam University, and Mr. Ali Sultan, who's an international law expert and teaches law at the Business School at Lahore University of Management Sciences. Professor Sirajuddin, language and power, and I was going through this very interesting book by Robin Lakoff, who was a linguistic professor. And he says, making meaning is a defining activity of Homo sapiens. It is more than just a cognitive exercise, since those who get to superimpose a meaning on events control the future of their society. And since so much of our cognitive capacity is achieved via language, control of language, the determination of what words mean, who can use what forms of language to what effects, in which settings, is power. Hence, the struggles I am discussing are not tussles over mere words or just semantics. They are battles.
They
How
are indeed.
far would you agree with that?
I agree. I think that anything that the Homo sapiens have attributed to them can have a lethal and a dangerous side, and can also have a creative and a positive side. So language is just one aspect of us Homo sapiens. And yes, it is, as we were talking about earlier today, as Harold Pinter, who's a British playwright, pointed out, language is a highly ambiguous business. So often below the word spoken is the thing known and unspoken. Pinter obviously was talking, I think, more philosophically, more psychologically. We know that in politics, very often it is understood that what is being said is not what is being said.
I was just listening to an interview by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, difficult name, where he says relations between art and politics. He says, I'm interested in politics because I'm an artist. I'm not in art because of politics. I am in politics because of my artistic calling. Now, there have been debates, in various literatures, in various languages, about whether it's art for art's sake or whether it's art has some kind of purpose. He obviously believes that it has a purpose. He was also arrested at one point. He was nearly got killed by the regime, but for Amnesty International that secured his release. So it's something that kind of cuts very close to the bone as far as he's concerned. How would you look at the purpose of art, considering that language is used in a certain way? If language is being used in a certain way, is there a necessity or an imperative to actually counter it in a different way?
Yes, and I think that the the language of art can redress and can counter lies and falsehood and so on. But I don't think that we can limit this debate to simply language. I think what you've been talking about is really goes to the heart of the problem, which is, do we separate the two things? Is the artist also not somebody who breathes the ordinary air? Edward Bond said that the very act of breathing is a political act. So I think that the way that that the artist absorbs politics or what is happening outside is different. The processes are different, but I think that there is a connection, and there isn't a one-to-one connection. So as Auden said, a poem will not make anything happen as such. But obviously, since artists are human beings and they connect with the world outside them, they are obviously registering in different ways realities. And of course, they transform the reality that they reflect. They transform it. They don't change it or falsify it. I think that they enhance the truth of it, and they strengthen it. So in a sense, the artist can speak the truth very loudly without having to shout.
Without having to shout. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, as a historian and also as someone who does comparative work, how do you look at this idea of exercising power? What are the tools we have? And I ask this specifically with reference, for instance, to the term terrorism. What exactly is terrorism? We don't have a definition for it, although there is a UN resolutions regime that deals with what they call quote-unquote terrorist entities. But there are also UNGA resolutions that talk about why it is legitimate to have armed resistance against occupation, whether it's in Palestine or in occupied Kashmir. But we've seen that post 9/11, there's been a deliberate conflation of armed struggle with terrorism. So can you give us a sense of the historical trajectory, in terms of the development to this point where we stand today?
Well, the basic thing is that from the earliest recorded histories, what we know is that powerful states, powerful empires, have reacted very, very badly to attempts to defy them or to attempts to otherwise contest their physical or their intellectual authority over a group of people whom they have either already subjugated or whom they wish to subjugate. If you go back 2,500 years, for instance, to Herodotus, the Greco-Persian wars basically begin because the Ionian city-states rebel against Persian rule. The Athenians intervene to sort of help them, and they end up sacking an important Persian city, which then outrages the Persian emperor, and he decides that, well, we're going to teach the Athenians a lesson. So in that respect, because the world is full of asymmetries, and those asymmetries are rooted in historical experience, in the circumstances that societies evolve in, it's only natural that different groups of people operating at different levels of power and organization will contest things with each other using the means that are best suited to their circumstances. So in that respect, when we talk again about terrorism or other such things, to quote a more recent example, the First World War was triggered by an act of terrorism, i.e. the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian-backed terrorist outfit, the Black Hand. And the Serbians, of course, were much weaker than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they were trying to destabilize the Austro-Hungarian control over Bosnia-Herzegovina. And they were doing so by supporting various ethno-nationalistic groups, splinter groups, etc. And of course, when they succeeded in killing the Archduke, the Austrian Empire used it as a pretext for launching a war against Serbia, which then, triggers a Russian and then a German and then a French intervention, triggering the outbreak of the First World War. So, in that context, wherever there is a very great imbalance between the power of two groups of people that are in conflict, it's inevitable that the weaker group will attempt to employ asymmetric means to further their interests or to resist what they regard as an undesirable imposition upon them. And that resistance throughout history has been branded as rebellion, treason, terrorism, whatever you want to call it, by more powerful groups of actors.
Okay. Setting the narrative, Sultan, you're a lawyer. When you draft something, you're very, very cautious about where you're putting your commas and your full stops, how you're setting off your subclauses. Is that a function merely of semantics of words, or is there some significance attached to this?
Right. First of all, thank you for having me, Ejaz. Of course, law is a language unto itself. So every comma, every period, every phrase, the taxonomy, that assumes a lot of significance, and cases in courts are decided on the basis of legal language and their interpretation. Now, coming back to what we have been discussing, which is terrorism and the idea of terrorism under international law. Now, international law does not function the way domestic law or municipal law functions, in the sense that it's horizontal, where every state has an equal right and opportunity to participate in the making and the setting of the narrative, consequently setting of the narrative under international law. So we see when it comes to terrorism, states like Israel, the United States, and India, they've really been at the forefront of setting the narrative on the phraseology, the taxonomy of whether a freedom movement can be sort of described rather than being described as a freedom movement, can it be described as a terrorism as a terrorist activity or not? And that's what we have seen. Israel started developing this argument in the background of the attacks that it suffered from PLO beginning in the 1960s and 1970s. And then we had this first batch of conventions, international law on terrorism. We have the hijacking convention and so on and so forth, and terrorist bombing convention. But all of these conventions never defined terrorism. They sort of stayed clear of the intent element, that you require in a terrorism situation. And they said that we're just going to describe terrorism in terms of the actions, and we're not going to worry about the intentions or the motivations. So they tried to skirt around, and this difference still persists, which is why even today under international law there is no universal consensus on the definition of a terrorism, and that is precisely why there is this comprehensive convention on international terrorism has not been adopted by the global community. But that said, the United States then in the backdrop of 9/11 then further extended the narrative of terrorism, the global war on terror, and so on and so forth. And they really did it under the umbrella of the United Nations Security Council, where they had a raft of UN Security Council resolutions dealing with counterterrorism, such as 1267, which deals with the listing of terrorist groups, and so on and so forth, and 1373 and 1540, which deals with nuclear terrorism, and so on and so forth. So that's another framework which has evolved, and Financial Action Task Force, for instance, is also linked to that. It's a body which is meant to give meaning to these resolutions. So that's the framework that we have today, and in all of this, these ideas of genuine freedom or genuine national liberation movements, which erstwhile enjoyed support under several United Nations General Assembly resolutions and so on and so forth, that distinction seems to have been dissolved.
Dissolved?
Dissolved or vitiated, in the sense that, post 9/11, the dominant narrative is that every act of political violence, no matter what the intent or what the motive is or what the motivation is, we're going to call it terrorism. So that's where we're at.
We cannot assign any significance to those UNGA resolutions that are still on the record?
We can assign, sure, we can assign, but we'll have to do conversing for that. With other member states in the United Nations, we'll have to engage in active diplomacy on all fronts when it comes to that.
So once again, we face the reality of what Ilhan said, the asymmetries of power.
Right.
And given those asymmetries of power, history deals, Professor Sirajuddin, history deals with facts, so does political analysis and the rest of it. But the artist, while dealing with reality, also assumes a lot of complexity in a situation. For instance, as we were talking earlier, I was talking about the Algerian thing, and for instance, Fanon or Sartre were very clear, and the French intellectual left was very clear where they wanted to, which side they were on. But Camus, Pierre Noir, was looking at, he was disconcerted both by what Paris was doing, but also what the Algerian resistance movement was doing to the Algerian French. So he was looking at the complexity in a more sort of wholesome way. You also have taught a lot of Irish literature, which obviously carries references to what happened to Ireland. Can you give us a sense of how that theme is developed and in what way?
Well, it's there in the literature, and I think that this whole question of how far art is to address what is happening in the world around us is something that is constantly being negotiated in literature. And I don't think that any artist has really arrived at a resolution, that whether I'm for the ivory tower of art, or whether my art has to actually have, as it were, a purpose or whatever, which is political, social, or whatever. And this is something that we find has been there. I mean, you've talking about Irish literature, Seamus Heaney, W.B. Yeats before him, Evan Boland, who is a contemporary woman poet. They all talk about, in different ways, the relationship between the individual sensibility and consciousness and human beings and the bigger picture. So, and this issue of being on this side or that side is interesting, because the quotation that Sartre used in the Fanon introduction was, Achilles' lance has to heal the wound which that it has inflicted. Now, could that mean that then violence means violence, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth? Or does one then negotiate the whole business of, language, and what do we mean? Just as this gentleman just pointed out, that anything that happens, if there is a gas leak and a cylinder blows up, on the news, what we hear is, we don't yet know whether it is an act of terrorism or simply a domestic appliance which is, or an industrial appliance which is blown up. I don't know if I'm at cross purposes, but I think that is something that the artist is aware of and is constantly negotiating.
That's a very interesting word,
and it's not, it's not only to do with Ireland. It's to do with, I mean, very recently there was a tribute being paid to Agha Shahid Ali, who the Kashmiris claim as their
Their poet,
international
yeah.
voice as their poet. Although he was not born in Srinagar, and he spent some time there, but nevertheless, he deals with it in his poetry as well. And this whole business of being both inside a situation and writing about it and being on the outside, and that, of course, is a difficult issue. I mean, it's all very well to be, in a sense, romancing outrage and tut-tutting about it. But also, how much are you there, actually? And this is what happened with Seamus Heaney. He was in Northern Ireland. That was where he was born and so on. And in the midst of the Troubles, he was in Northern Ireland, and that went on for a long time. I mean, he was writing most of his major work. And then eventually he decided that it was impossible for him to work in Northern Ireland. So he goes over to Southern Ireland, because he thought that there would be a relative peace and quiet there. But he has a poem which is absolutely redolent with guilt, and a lot of people who who came forward and said, "Look, he's betrayed our side. We needed a man to speak up," and so on.
That's also a very important aspect of resistance.
Yes.
Where the hardliners are not only fighting against what they consider as the occupation force, but may also, and in fact do, perpetrate violence against their own side on people who are prepared to negotiate, or who do not consider that violence is going to ultimately achieve its purpose. So they will kill those people also. And that's something which, in a world which is becoming extremely divisive, is something which has become a major problem. We see this in India now. Wherever the liberal Indians are speaking up, they are under threat from the RSS goons. It's the same thing with white supremacists. It's the same thing with like the Boko Haram or the Al-Qaeda or the ISIS groups. So, and then of course we have the digital interconnectedness, that allows these groups to actually become more vociferous and gain. Now, in this kind of environment, how does an artist survive who's actually writing about this?
Well, I was watching an interview with Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian playwright, and he was asked about this, and he talked about Nigeria, and he talked about Boko Haram, and where he felt various governments hadn't really done what they were meant to do, and hadn't turned out to be the appropriate caretakers, as it were. But he said that I press on, I teach, I lecture, I write, I have workshops. So, as I said, the artist doesn't have a lead directly plugged into what is happening outside. So there isn't a one-to-one connection. But I think that there is a process, a very complex process of accretion and absorption, which then ultimately, presumably, will have some effect on the on sensibilities, on human culture.
On human culture. At this point, we're going to take a short break. At the other end of the break, we'll continue with this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, we're talking, of course, about the language, asymmetries, power, how states and powerful groups maintain and sustain power. We also talked about how the artist deals with it, how, as Professor Sirajuddin said, he or she negotiates. Give us a sense of, since you gave us examples of power asymmetries historically, how does the historian deal with it? And since I said earlier that you have also done comparative work, what exactly does it entail?
Well, the first thing is that you can look at asymmetries that exist within a society. So, for instance, we know from, let's say, the history, the economic history of the last 200 years, that when inequality increases in a society beyond a certain point, then what happens is that in order to retain control, in order to retain authority, ruling elites typically start to employ a greater quotient of identity politics. Now, that greater quotient of identity politics typically has the effect of atomizing a society or polarizing a society into a majoritarian potential tyranny and other groups in that society that don't necessarily adhere to or don't necessarily conform to the ideal type of identity that is being forcibly or loudly projected. Now, this tends to make states and it tends to make societies far more bellicose towards each other as well, because typically these domestic asymmetries also play out across international borders. So in the, let's say, South Asian context, what we've seen is that, let's say, over the last 30 years, India's experiment with opening up its economy with neoliberal capitalism, etc., has produced tremendous wealth. It has also produced tremendous inequality, that basically India has returned to British Raj levels of internal inequality. And as that inequality has grown, the BJP as well as other elements have employed communalist and other identity-driven politics in order to shore up political support. And they have been richly supported in this by corporate and business elites. So, as for example, Thomas Piketty has argued, India is going from the British Raj to the billionaire Raj. And one of the consequences of the billionaire Raj is rampant identity politics. These identity politics can be greatly amplified through social media, through various platforms that are incidentally also under the control of a plutocracy or under the control of an extremely wealthy minority. So you have a situation where people's sentiments, people's identities can be stoked within a society. Now, when that naturally happens, it obviously produces resistance. And those within a society that resist such attempts can be branded as, the dissidents, as terrorists, as deviants, as whatever. And the coercive apparatus of that state or that society can be unleashed upon them. So that's, one element to it, that there is a fairly well established correlation between growing inequality and growing identity politics, and identity politics inevitably lead to a greater amount of violence within states and also ultimately between states, because it diminishes in some respects the rationality of the state as an actor. Other, of course, problems stem from real world political conflicts over territory, over resources, over other circumstantial factors. And those real conflicts, of course, are there. They can be exacerbated or they can be better managed. Typically, when the first type of trend starts to set in and it starts to have a large effect, it becomes harder to resolve the other type of dispute or manage the other type of dispute without recourse to greater coercion, greater brinkmanship. And what we see happening, of course, at a global level is that what we see is that there is a growth of this inequality, a growth of identity politics, and a fissuring of the international political or institutional architecture as it struggles to cope with these tendencies.
That's a very interesting and detailed response, Ali Sultan, but it's also deeply ironic that the sentiments of the majority that is feeling the pain of inequality is being addressed to the advantage of the very rich who are responsible in the first place for creating that inequality. So you suddenly have a billionaire like Trump actually saying that I represent white America and I am going to provide jobs to these people and I will do things for them. Even though he has been legally not paying taxes and finding all those loopholes in and through which he moved to, create his empire.
Yeah, well, I think as your guest explained, as inequality has grown, these forces of identity politics and ethno-nationalism combined, with the fact that the social media platforms have really exacerbated this problem. And I was just reading this interview of Jack Dorsey, who's the CEO of Twitter, in the New Yorker. I think it just came out yesterday. And, he frankly admitted that I have really no solution to controlling, this Frankenstein that I've created in terms of political misinformation, exacerbating violent tendencies. The Christchurch attack, for instance, was broadcast was broadcast live on Facebook, and the Sri Lankan attackers, they were peddling their ideology on different Facebook groups. So they really are not stringent enough, or actually there's a total absence of legal structures, which could deal with this problem. And also they don't seem to have any internal mechanisms, neither Facebook nor Twitter, to sort of deal with this problem.
No,
so it's nipped in the bud.
Okay, so I was talking to someone who works at Facebook. And the problem really is that the platform requires more and more and more people to put more and more and more content there. That's how it works.
Because they're going to use that content, that's their business model. They're going to lure you to sign up, put up as much digital footprint as you can, and then they're going to use that in designing all the different AI algorithms, and that's where the technology is headed.
Yeah, but at the same time, they are now being forced, in some places legally, in other areas, I think more normatively, people are objecting to this. So they're being forced into policing some content, but they do it very reluctantly. Yeah. And it happens only when there is a major tragedy, like the shooter actually real-time recording what he was doing and streaming it on the World Wide Web.
Right.
Professor Sirajuddin, I don't know if you look at this new Frankenstein, as we call it, the Facebook and Twitter and the rest of it, because this is more like the millennial kind of thing. But do you think this is being written about in terms of in terms of its positivities and its negativities in literature?
I think it is, but if you allow me to not address what you're asking me, but to go back to something what was said earlier, you spoke about, the historian spoke about asymmetries and inequalities, and you used the word irony.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting as well that inequality might be one of the triggers for various types of violence and so on and so forth. But it can also then go across class, because in many instances that we have seen in recent history, the people who are actually instrumental in perpetrating acts of violence come from affluent families. So they are in turn part of a system of inequality which has given them privileges. How can an artist keep up with the act of somebody recording himself killing people? I mean, even the stage can't do it.
Yeah.
Drama can't compete with that. So I really think that there will need to be, for the artists, they will need to invent a new kind of language in terms of communication of ideas.
What language Would
I
that
don't
be-
mean language per se as simply words,
Yeah.
which will be rarefied and which will be different. But I think we do need to look for an alternative way of communicating with human beings without, as it were, completely brainwashing them and conditioning their responses. As a teacher, I see that all the time. My students, in a sense, are also being brainwashed by what they receive through these various devices.
Yeah, sure.
Just if I can just add something which we were talking about earlier. Now, I mean, in terms of these vested special interests which hold a lot of power, as your guest in Islamabad also mentioned, there's a tiny minority which controls these social platforms. The Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. They've got tremendous advocacy firms working for them in the United States. So in the U.S. now, for the last 1 or 2 years, ever since these allegations of Russian interference in the U.S. elections via these social media platforms surfaced. So there's been an attempt to come up with a comprehensive privacy, data protection and privacy laws in the U.S. because right now there isn't any, right? And since Facebook, Twitter, all of them are incorporated in the United States, that's the place where you'd want that law to come from. So just to give you an idea about their lobbying power. Now, Facebook has been lobbying the U.S. government to come up with a law, but they don't want it to be a state law. They want it to be a federal law because that would not encumber them as much as state laws would. So that's a very good.
Yeah, because there would be a multiplicity of laws.
Exactly. So they'd come under a plethora of regulations. That way, they don't want that. They want to remain as unencumbered as possible, and they're using all their lobbying might right now in the United States to achieve that.
Okay. I also have to wrap up, so let me go across to Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Ilhan, tell me this about this paradox. So, on the one hand, these digital platforms are owned by a very small minority. On the other hand, these platforms incorporate millions and millions of people. Now, give me a sense of who's controlling whom. Is this now a Frankenstein? Or is it, so what is the cause to effect situation here? I want to try and understand this.
Well, in order to understand this, I think a good example is the Chinese intranet, in the sense that there you don't have most of these Western platforms available. You have Chinese equivalents of these platforms. The government effectively walls off the Chinese internet from any external influences it deems subversive. And the various social and other platforms that are available on the Chinese internet, they are effectively controlled by the government in order to project a single state-approved worldview to the population at large. And any deviation from that worldview, even an indirect deviation, can be tracked, it can be logged, and it can lead to real-world consequences for the individual who is deviating. So there is one, let's say, instance that you can have, let's say, a state monopoly internet on the pattern of the Chinese. The Western model, of course, is essentially capitalistic in that profitable companies control the internet. They own, in a sense, the data that their users put into them, and they then use that data in order to advertise, in order to sell people products, in order to increase user engagement with their platform. And obviously, the more people are there, the more money they make. So in that context, what you have in the Western internet is the emergence of a kind of internet plutocracy, where you have a few very large, powerful groups that are essentially able to control the information or the data or the whole feel of how the internet and how the digital media space operates. The other thing, of course, is that it is not in the financial interest of any of these platforms to minimize conflict, because the more conflict there is on social media, the more heavily engaged people will be with that platform. Just think about trolls on the internet. I mean, the amount of time that any person who would have a certain number of followers or a certain amount of engagement would deal fending off trolls is very, very high. But the fact is that the trolls, from the point of view of the social media company, are good because the trolls are highly engaged users. They stay logged into the platform. They see lots of advertisements. They cause other people to retweet them or to repaste them
Absolutely.
or to follow them or whatever. So in that context, conflict on the social media absolutely sells, since those companies have to make money in that sense.
Okay. I have to thank you, Dr. Niaz. Unfortunately, this is all the time I have for the second part of our program. The first part was aired yesterday. So Indus Special is essentially done for this week, but we'll be back with you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.